Hi, I'm Doug Hocking, and I'm here to talk about two extraordinary Cochise County Cowboys, Grant Wheeler and Joe George. Grant Wheeler was a working cowboy as well as a regular rodeo cowboy who made it into the newspapers consistently, and Joe George was his sidekick. Grant decided to take his rodeo skills a little further, but we'll get to that in a moment. Let's talk about Cochise County. It's kind of a special place. We're down here in the southeast corner of Arizona. You can see some of the principal towns we'll be talking about: Wilcox, Dragoon Summit, and Steens, which is just over the line in New Mexico. Uh, what doesn't come across right away is that this was a place of wealth in the late 19th century. It was a place of fairly high population. We had Tombstone and Bisbee, and off the map to the right, Silver City over in New Mexico. These were mining towns, and some of the largest towns between St. Louis and San Francisco. Money was on the move here. And more than that, this is the great southern um, corridor. Today they call it the I-10 corridor. But even back then, it was the corridor through which the rail line and which mail and wagon trains flowed. It was a low spot in the mountains, unlike any other until you go north into Wyoming to South Pass, a pass that's closed half the year by snows. So there was traffic moving through here and wealth and payrolls. Uh, the miners, they figured out how to protect the product of the mines. They cast gold and silver ingots so heavy that you couldn't put them in your saddlebags. You needed a wagon to carry them. And that was proof against holdups. But train robberies, well, we had a very, very large number of them down here. Steens got hit 3 times right there on the New Mexico border, where you could take the train in New Mexico and head into Arizona, crossing jurisdictions. Plus, there was no law in Steens. Uh, Even the Phoenix newspapers noticed that there was something special about Southeast Arizona. Uh, that there had really been a lot of robberies down here. Well, with population in that southern corridor, that was likely. But Virgil Earp put it down to something else. Virgil thought that it might be a result of our population. He figured it was the last place that the bad element, the Cowboys, had to hang out. Now, the Cowboys came here very often from Texas, where they were either wanted or, depending on how you looked at it, unwanted. They came up as drovers, bringing herds to feed the reservations and the military. They got here, got paid off, gambled a bit, uh, wasted some on wicked women, and drank up the remains. And then they had no money to get back home and no prospect for a job. So they robbed stagecoaches. It may be that they couldn't take the gold and silver ingots, but payrolls had to move. Now, the railroads protected themselves. The big money was in what's called through safes. And the express messenger didn't have access to them. The keys were in places like El Paso and San Diego at the end of the line. But the payroll still traveled in another safe that the messenger did have access to. And registered mail traveled by train. And back in those days, it contained a good deal of money. But that bad element settled in here, robbed stagecoaches, rustled cattle, And occasionally they get ambitious and hit the big herds, the big ranches, rustling up a small herd for themselves to start the smaller ranches. So the smaller ranchers were a population friendly to the cowboys, that is, friendly to the outlaws. We have our own four corners down here. Sonora, Chihuahua, New Mexico, and Arizona all come together at one spot. And it made it easy for outlaws to jump jurisdictions. Well, let's talk about our heroes, Joe George and Grant Wheeler. Grant got his name in the newspapers again and again in 1894. He shows up in January riding Sherman Clump's bay horse Bunk. And in February, it's noted that he was injured, dislocated his shoulder in a steer tying contest. That's a pretty important rodeo cowboy to get mentioned in the papers. In August, he wins a race again, riding on Bunk. And in September, he takes his rodeo skills to the streets of Wilcox and ropes him with his brand new lasso, a Chinese dishwasher. The dishwasher did not take kindly to this, cut his way free, ruining the new lasso, and went and got himself a pistol. Not to be outdone, Grant went back to his cow camp and got his pistol. And then both of them got arrested for carrying guns in town. In October, Grant got drunk during Roundup and started an argument with someone. Cy Bryant, one of the bosses, tried to break it up. And Grant shot him in the stomach. Thinking him dead, Grant hopped on the back of a friend's horse, and away they went. Learning in the newspapers that Cy hadn't died but was only slightly wounded, Grant came back and turned himself in and was released on $500 bail. And that's where we find him in January of 1895. Now we got to look at how you go about robbing a train. Grant told his friends that if I get tired of rodeoing and cowboying, I know how to make an easy living. Nothing simpler than to rob a train. Well, you don't do it the way they do it in the movies. You don't ride up behind the train. Your horse would probably object to the gravel, the ties, and the rails, and probably wouldn't let you get close enough. And if he did, in the attempt to jump on, you'd probably die and then find yourself at entirely the wrong end of the train. You could try jumping on from a cut or from a bridge, but you're likely to end up dead again. And again, you're at the wrong part of the train. And you get to run up over the roofs, jumping the gaps between cars. Sure, all the way to the engine. Doesn't work too well. The other thing the movies show is sticking up passengers. And while the passengers definitely believed this was true, we'd find them in cases hiding under the seats, hiding their valuables in toilets and in the furnace, the stove in the cars. People thoroughly terrified. But you know what? A lot of those passengers had guns and knew how to use them. And that was a lot of people to control. And they didn't have all that much money. It was a hard way to make a living. So what did you go after? You went after the express car and you went after the through safe if you knew what you were doing. And how do you get there? Well, you could dig up the track, but that was dangerous. That'd cause a train wreck. The engine might explode. It might destroy the express car in the process, and you were likely to kill the fireman and the engineer. Besides, if you're an outlaw, that sounds entirely too much like work. Well, if you knew railroad operations, you could signal the train to stop. You put torpedoes on the track. Torpedoes were small explosive charges, and if you didn't have one, a bullet would do. As the train rolls over it explodes, goes bang. Bang, bang meant danger ahead. Bang, bang, bang meant stop. And you wave a red lantern, which the engineer will either interpret as danger ahead or house of ill repute, either of which is likely to get him to stop. What, you didn't realize that that's what red lanterns were all about? Legend has it that the engineers took the red lantern with them into town and hung them outside the doors of houses of ill repute where they were spending the evening, so that the crew would know where they were in case of an emergency. Perhaps not, but still, this is said to be how red light districts got their name. If you didn't know railroad operations, you could board the train in town, take over the engine and tell the engineer to get moving, get out of town, where you can rob the train in peace. The only problem was this was apt to draw entirely too much attention from law enforcement. Oops. Or you could try riding the blind baggage. That is the end of the baggage car that didn't have a door and therefore was blind. And you'd hunker down in there as a deadhead, what they called a deadhead in those days. It's where the hobos rode, and hope you weren't noticed. The trains were conveniently organized, engine in the lead, tender behind, that is the fuel and water, and right behind that, the baggage car. And beyond the baggage car, the express car, and then the messenger cars. Why do they organize trains like this? Perhaps so sparks and smoke wouldn't get at the passengers. Nonetheless, it was convenient for outlaws. I mean, there you have it, the baggage car and then the express car. You ride right in here. When the train's out of town, you climb them up over the tender to the engine and take possession. And that's exactly what Grant and Joe George tried to do in Wilcox, Arizona on January 30, 1895. They rode as deadheads, and an alert brakeman spotted them. He was soon joined by the firemen. The two boys decided to offer a buck to ride as far as Dragoon Summit. And either being honest or, well, not trusting each other, the firemen and brakemen said no, and Grant and Joe drew their pistols and escorted them back to the engine. Taking possession, they told the engineer to put that train in motion. But by now, the attention of the entire town had been drawn. Wilcox, only about 3 blocks deep and 3 wide. Now the entire town, with the exception of one person, knew that a holdup was in progress. That one person was Sheriff C.S. Fly. Yes, that C.S. Fly, the photographer who spent one term as our sheriff. Now, I don't know if the folks at Wilcox figured it unsporting to let Fly know, or he just got the word late. Nonetheless, when he got the word that the train had been robbed, he looked for a horse and couldn't find one, and so pursued the train on foot out into the Willcox Playa and didn't catch up. Out in the playa a couple of miles, the outlaws ordered the train stopped and the passenger cars disconnected. While they were doing this, the alert express messenger gathered up all the payroll and loose money, stuffed it in his pockets, jumped off the express car, closing the door behind him, and ran back toward Wilcox, perhaps hoping to encounter C.S. Fly. The outlaws now had the lightened train move further out into the playa to about the spot shown in the picture. And there they escorted the engineer back to the express car, meanwhile telling the brakeman, run back to the passenger cars and inform the passengers that if they don't try to interfere, they're in no danger. Now, holding a gun to the engineer's head, they ordered the expressman to open the door. He, being most of the way back to Wilcox, didn't hear them. So Grant and Joe, instead of killing the engineer, blew the door off the express car. They bought dynamite, fuse, and caps in Wilcox the day prior, and this was part of their undoing. Folks said, why did they need that? We're going to blow stumps. Oh, not so much. Folks realized who it was. They were well known in town. So they blew the door and they got in the express car, where they found the loose change gone, but 8,000 pesos in 1,000 peso sacks were lying there. They didn't value the pesos beyond the ton lot, and so used them instead as tamping on this explosion to direct it downward into the safe. And lighting the thing off, they blew the express car and pesos all over the playa. They embedded pesos in the remains of the express car, in telegraph poles, and scattered them. The Mexican population of Wilcox came out the next day to collect what they could, but we were still finding them in the 1960s, 70 odd years later. The railroad was seriously upset by the loss of their express car, and Wells Fargo by the loss of their safe. And so 5 posses went in pursuit and couldn't find a hide nor hair of the boys. They knew who they were looking for. They actually had a picture of that rodeo hero, Grant Wheeler. We're told that remote ranchers didn't have much choice but to offer hospitality to outlaws. And that may be true, fearing for their lives. But you'd think once they were gone, they might let the posse know which direction they'd gone. But no, Grant and Joe enjoyed the hospitality of Cochise County for almost a month. And other things came of this. There were folks inspired by what they'd done. Grant and Joe in 95 blew up the Southern Pacific Express car on the Willcox Playa. Inspired by them, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid 4 years later would blow up an express car on the Union Pacific. And we know that it was inspiration from these boys because they did it at Wilcox, Wyoming. A tribute to Grant and Joe. Grant and Joe resurfaced on February 25, 1895 at Steens. Steens. It's pronounced Steens. It was named for Enoch Steen, but the railroad didn't necessarily know that. It's a waterless pass, but the railroad needed a watering point, and so brought in water by the tanker load. Consequently, the town never grew very much and didn't have any law enforcement, and was almost 100 miles from Tombstone, where the Cochise County law was sheriff lived, and almost as far from Silver City, where the Grant County law lived. And so it was the ideal spot to take a train, which is what they did. They hopped on board the train and ordered the cars disconnected, heading out into the San Simon Valley. And there, ordering the train to stop, they handed a burlap sack to the engineer and said, "Fill this with stones and gravel." And he, thinking them perhaps mad, did so. And having the bag mostly full, he looked up at the two outlaws and said, "Why am I doing this?" And they said, "We're going to use it to tamp the explosion when we blow the safe." The engineer said, "But we don't have a safe on the engine." "No, silly, the one in the express car. But you told me to leave that behind in Steen's." At this point, the outlaws recognized the error of their ways, and began to curse. They did this in fully biblical terms, avoiding the gynecological and scatological. They began with the chairman of the board of the railroad, worked their way down through the board members to the president of the company, and then went on to the engineers, the firemen, the conductors, the brakemen, and the Pullman porters. And then went back and started cursing the rails, the cross ties, the sidings, and the spur lines, all the way from San Francisco to New Orleans. They then went back and started on the bridges and the rolling stock, never repeating themselves once. And finally, running out of steam, the engineer standing there, believing he'd encountered a religious revival, watched the two outlaws ride away. But they were not left to themselves. They were pursued by both railroad and Wells Fargo detectives. Working for the railroad was William Billy Breckenridge. You might remember him from the 1893 film Tombstone, the little fellow with glasses who was a deputy sheriff. Well, Billy was a deputy sheriff, but he wasn't at all like the character in the movies. Billy was actually a tough lawman and dogged in his persistence. Billy had just enough of Wells Fargo detective John Thacker. He says Thacker wanted to hang around Tombstone, and he got an idea that he was going to drug some whiskey and get it smuggled out to the outlaws. And when they were unconscious, he'd go out and tie them up. And boy, that's like putting salt on a bird's tail. And so Billy went his own way with a picture of Grant Wheeler. And he heard that Grant was up at Cortez, Colorado. Arriving in Cortez, he learned that Grant had gone to Durango, where Billy knew the sheriff. And arriving in Durango, he discovered that they'd gone to Farmington. And in Farmington, a rancher told him, "Yeah, those are the ones that our children call the bad men, who are camped out by the San Juan River, but they've left and gone to Cortez." Billy headed back to Cortez, where he learned that they'd probably gone to the mountains of Utah, which his friend, the sheriff of Durango, was said to know well. So he headed back toward Durango, and stopping in Mancos, showed Grant's picture around. And sure enough, a rancher's wife said, "Yeah, we know those guys. They come into town to the saloon every night to get drunk. They're camped out by the arroyo." So Billy waited outside the saloon for the drunken Grant to emerge, and he didn't. So the next morning, Billy took his posse out to the arroyo, and Grant came up out of the arroyo, saw the posse, and ducked back in. And then, in an effort to escape the noose, for it was a hanging offense to rob a train in New Mexico and Arizona, to escape the noose, a shot was heard, and Grant was no more. And Joe George, well, according to legend, Joe George was shot and killed a few weeks after the robbery down in Mexico with only $20 in his pocket. Thanks for listening, and take care.